The nation of Cyprus narrowly avoids fiscal collapse as the larger European economy dodges yet another financial bullet. Why is Europe lurching from crisis to crisis? And if so, where will the contagion spread next? That's coming up on The Line. This is On the Line. I'm Doug Bernard. When it was first proposed, the European Economic Union was supposed to create stability and growth across the continent. Well, lately, that's pretty much the only thing the Euro nations haven't seen. Economists call it contagion, how one nation's economic stumbles might cascade into a continent-wide economic fall. Is contagion for real? And can it be contained or even prevented? Well, in just a moment, we'll hear one economist's prescription, but the medicine might not taste so good. But first, the most recent flare-up of Europe's economic bug appeared on the divided island nation of Cyprus. But this wasn't just any economic illness. Cyprus' story is as much about organized crime as it is government overspending. Earlier, we spoke with journalist Nicholas Shaxson about the curious case of Cyprus. Nicholas Shaxson is a journalist and writer living in Zurich, Switzerland. He's also author of the 2010 book Treasure Islands, uncovering the damage of offshore banking and tax havens, and he's joining us from Zurich via Skype. Mr. Shaxson, let's begin if we can. Give us a sketch as to what you see recently happened in Cyprus.
Well, Cyprus is a tax haven. It is a small tax haven, and effectively the economy had basically been dominated by the financial services industry, and it had been very much Russians and Ukrainians, former ex-Soviets, had been using Cyprus. Now, what happened? Cyprus it's a tax haven in a couple of main respects. One is bank deposits. There's quite a bit of a lot of depositors had money there. But also it is a tax haven providing structures. So you might own an asset in London, say, through a Cyprus company, and that provides all sorts of secrecy and various other facilities. What happened in Cyprus was that on the deposit side, so basically there was a bankruptcy and a bailout, and the conditions of the bailout were that the depositors should be among those who take a hit, as well as shareholders of the banks and so on. And that created all sorts of big questions about banking. It created a lot of ripples in Europe. And one of the most significant aspects of that was that an initial part of the package, which was subsequently reversed, was to make small depositors take a haircut. So people under 100,000 euros who were supposed to have been protected by deposit insurance were supposed to take a haircut, alongside the bigger depositors and wealthy Russians and so on. And this provoked remarkable outrage, unsurprisingly, in Cyprus, and eventually a package was agreed where only the larger depositors would take a haircut. But what was interesting about this was that this struck directly at the tax haven model, the fact that large Russian and other depositors were taking a big hit on their deposits, effectively told them that Cyprus is no longer safe. This is not a safe jurisdiction to park your assets. And it seems likely that the whole financial services industry in Cyprus, or at least a very significant part of it, will probably go out of business as a result of this. So it's almost unprecedented in the tax haven world. We haven't really seen anything like this before.
Right. So if I may, how was it that this small Mediterranean divided island nation came to be such a magnet for Russian and Ukrainian money?
Well, essentially, a lot of tax havens are small places, by no means all, but many are small places. And what happens, you see a kind of remarkable process of what I would describe as political capture by the offshore financial services industry. In other words, the money people from outside come in and they effectively start controlling the politics of the place, and they allow and basically you get a kind of anything goes model to financial regulation. So even though Cyprus's own laws weren't particularly egregious in tax haven terms, I mean, there are other tax havens that are substantially more secretive than Cyprus. It was selling to a large degree, non-compliance with its own laws. So it was turning a blind eye to this money. And now that the kind of balloon has gone up, there've been a lot of interesting revelations emerged about the extent to which the political elite across all different parties were in bed with the financial services industry. I mean, if you look at the political backgrounds of the people in power and the finance minister and so on, they've all been very closely involved in this industry. And there's stories have emerged in the media of many politicians across the political spectrum having received loans, loans from Cypriot banks, which had been the key players in this sector, and loans which were written off. So these are kind of, it's a kind of bribery in a way. So it's a remarkable political tale of a small jurisdiction having been kind of captured by this financial services industry. I mean, I think Americans would say that to an extent politics in Washington has been captured by the financial services industry. But what you have in a place like Cyprus is you have the same kind of process happening, but it's a much purer process because, the United States is, Wall Street is a large financial center, but it is diluted in a very large and robust democracy. Whereas in Cyprus, you have a very small population, a tiny political elite, and a very large financial services, much larger in relation to the size of the population than the United States.
Right.
So you have this political capture, but in a much more kind of distilled, more crystallized way.
Since all of this started to happen, I've been reading accounts where people are saying that, look, it was an open secret that money from organized crime from Russia and the Ukraine was flowing into Cyprus. This was a secret I was not aware of, but apparently lots of people knew it. So how was this allowed to happen, and who's to blame?
Well, you're touching here on a question it's a fundamental question about tax havens. They have been flourishing, growing much faster than mainstream economies since the era of financial globalization began and really took off in around the 1970s. Why have they been tolerated? Why, tax havens sell a range of services, but one of the most prominent services is secrecy, which I don't think many people would agree is a good thing. Why has this been tolerated? The key reason is really that tax havens are the projects of the wealthiest and most influential people in society around the world. So, and countries such as Britain, which has a whole series of tax havens of its own that are partly British around the world, that are channeling money into Britain, have been very carefully making sure that this system is allowed to continue. You have organizations such as the OECD, which is the club of rich countries, which has officially been mandated as the kind of, the bodies that's supposed to be cracking down on secrecy. It has got a white, black and grey list system for tax havens, and the blacklist is completely empty. It's as if no bad tax havens exist, and this is of course not true. I mean, there's very much business as usual going on. So there is a great degree of tolerance by rich and powerful countries, including the United States, the United Kingdom, of tax haven activity, and Cyprus just fits that pattern.
Various economists argue that, look, tax havens are a sign of strength and of freedom and of liberty, and why shouldn't money, whether it's an individual's or corporate money, be allowed to follow find the lowest tax or the most favorable tax policies? You seem to be arguing that tax havens don't speak to any strength in the system, but more to a frailty of our global economic system.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's look at tax, for example. Through a variety of offerings, legal and illegal and grey area in between, tax havens do allow corporations and individuals to cut their tax bills. But what we must remember here is that these are the wealthiest sections of society. These are the wealthiest individuals and the wealthiest corporations. They are able to use this system outside their own democratic space to cut their own tax bills, and the result is that everybody else has to pick up the tab for them. So this is a kind of escape route. The same goes for secrecy. The wealthiest and most influential members of society are able to take their money offshore, wrap it in secrecy, and avoid their responsibilities to their own society. And tax havens such as Cyprus have contributed, they're never the only factor, but they have contributed significantly to the criminalization of the former Soviet Union, and also to all manner of ills in our own societies, rich countries and developing countries. So this freedom that is spoken of is freedom for a very small section of society, and it is freedom to escape from the responsibilities of society. And I think this is, a profoundly dangerous argument that is made in defense of tax havens.
So in 30 seconds or so, do you think Europe has learned the lesson here, that Cyprus has been dealt with and that the contagion has been contained?
I think Cyprus as a tax haven has been taken a very serious hit. I don't think necessarily that contagion from the whole European crisis is a multifaceted, complex thing, and it's going to be rolling on for some time. I don't think that has been contained, but I think Cyprus as a small tax haven has taken a very serious hit, and it may be the end of any serious offshore financial services industry there.
Nicholas Shaxson is a journalist and writer living in Zurich, Switzerland. His most recent book, published in 2010, is titled Treasure Islands, Uncovering the Damage of Offshore Banking and Tax Havens. He joined us via Skype from Zurich, Switzerland. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This is On the Line. I'm Doug Bernard. Can Europe's economic contagion be contained? And what if the medicine feels worse than the illness itself? Well, economist Daniel Mitchell has a few thoughts on the matter. He's a senior fellow at the CATO Institute here in Washington, studying international tax and fiscal policies, and joins us here. Daniel Mitchell, is there such a thing as economic contagion?
There's economic contagion in the sense that if investors, if savers, if business owners see that there are big problems in one country suddenly flaring up, and they look at their own country and say, we seem to have all the same characteristics, that makes them a little bit more aware, a little bit of recognition, if you will, of the problem, which isn't a bad thing. If both of us are coughing a lot, you go to the doctor and find out, oh my goodness, I have lung cancer. I might think, I should go to the doctor too and see if I have the same illness. So it gives them the ability to know we have a problem. And the sooner you know you have a problem, the more likely you are to engage it.
So is contagion really as much a matter of numbers and fiscal things that can be measured as it is rumors and feelings?
There's no question there's a psychology in the marketplace, and you could have countries in the European Union that are very, very well managed. Think of Luxembourg, Denmark,
Estonia,
Sweden, or something like that. Now, maybe investors and savers in those countries will get nervous, but in all likelihood, they probably can relax. Even though this is considered an EU problem, I really think it's a national government, national economy problem. If your country is overspent, like Greece or Italy, that's a problem you have to deal with. If your banks have made dodgy, bad loans and investments, say Cyprus or Spain, that's a problem you have to deal with. But it's not a euro problem per se.
So let's look at the most recent example, Cyprus. Who is to blame for what happened in Cyprus, from your perspective?
The banks made bad investments. If you look at their portfolios, they basically bought a lot of Greek government bonds. Well, what do we know happened to Greek government bonds in the last couple of years? Everyone who held those bonds got a very serious haircut. So if you're a Cyprus bank, you invested in Greek government bonds thinking that was a safe investment, all of a sudden you wind up thinking that, gee, I thought I had this many assets, now I really have this many assets, so they are insolvent now. So it wasn't the Cyprus government per se, it was the banks making bad decisions.
So if these banks, these are private banks you're talking about,
yes.
If these banks made bad decisions, why aren't they being forced to, as they say, take the haircut, to feel the pain of the fallout?
Well, they are being forced to feel the pain. In some sense, even though it's a muddled situation, what's happened in Cyprus isn't a bad outcome considering the mess they had gotten themselves into. The Cyprus government, yes, they've overspent. They don't have the ability to bail out their banking system. They couldn't do what we did with TARP. And that's actually a good thing, because what they should be doing is shutting down the insolvent institutions, and at least one of the two big banks is being shut down. So that means that the big money shareholders and the big money bondholders are going to lose out, and then they're going to protect depositors up to the 100,000 euros.
Right.
But then there's not enough money left over to bail out the big depositors. So all those big Russian money guys, some illegitimate, but a lot of them very legitimate people, they're going to wind up losing a chunk of their money.
So journalist Nicholas Shaxson, in his book, Treasure Islands, writes about Cyprus. This was several years ago, as well as some other offshore tax havens, generally speaking. And he argues that Cyprus and other nations demonstrate the frailty of our global capitalist system, not its strength. What did Cyprus teach you?
Well, my old friend Nick and I, we have different views on tax havens. I think that they're refuges for people from bad governments. So if I was an entrepreneur in Russia and I didn't want to worry about being shaken down by the corrupt Putin oligarchy, I would want to keep my money someplace else. But just like you can have good non-tax haven countries and bad non-tax haven countries, you can have well-run tax havens and poorly run tax havens. So if you put your money in Switzerland or Luxembourg, or for that matter, if you're a foreigner, you know, New York City is a tax haven in terms of the rules, your money's going to be reasonably safe. But if you put your money someplace that's poorly run or a place where banks just made a very bad decision to buy Greek government bonds, then you wind up taking a risk.
Now here we have, I guess you would say Cyprus was a bad tax haven. Is that a fair assessment?
It was a place where banks, the two big banks at least, made very, very poor decisions to invest in Greek government bonds. Now, people in Greece made very poor decisions to invest in Greek government bonds. Banks in Germany and France made very poor decisions to invest in Greek government bonds, but it was the magnitude of the purchases of Greek government bonds by the Cyprus banks that's what burned them. Just like if you bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities back in 2006, you right now would not be feeling very good.
No. Now, let's go back not quite that far, but it was as recently as 2008, 2009. Then British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, a number of European leaders were saying it's time to crack down on tax havens. Now, you wrote this recently. This is a CATO publication. You were talking about the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and you say the OECD essentially argues that it's illegitimate for businesses to shift economic activity to jurisdictions that have more favorable tax laws. I guess essentially means they're not directly arguing that, but in the end, that's the effect of their argument. Why should individuals, however, especially those perhaps like in the case of Cyprus, certainly some of those depositors were not all on the up and up, why should they have the ability to transfer money from haven to haven without some oversight or without some restrictions on that?
Well, fundamentally, this is an issue that defines libertarianism. You believe in the freedom of the individual over the power of the state. And so we think individuals should have the right to move their economic activity to the jurisdiction that best protects their personal liberties and freedoms. And whether or not you're an investor in Argentina who doesn't want the government to expropriate your assets, whether you're a family in Mexico that doesn't want the corrupt version of the IRS in Mexico to sell your information to kidnapping gangs, and then when you get back one of your kids' fingers in the mail with a ransom note, whether you're in Russia and you're worried about being shaken down by the Russian oligarchy, whether you're ethnic Chinese in Indonesia and you're worried about cultural and ethnic persecution. There are lots of people all over the world that want the ability to move their money someplace where it will be safer than in their home countries. I think as a libertarian, as a decent human being, I think that's a good thing, and I find that Gordon Brown and other people like that were reprehensible for trying to demagogue against tax havens during the financial crisis. Nobody in Liechtenstein told the Federal Reserve to have easy money policy. Nobody in the Cayman Islands had any responsibility for the corrupt subsidies from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The onshore world created the financial crisis, and then some of the politicians from the onshore world blamed the tax havens looking for a scapegoat.
What people were saying, however, also at the same time, was that some of these banks, some of the leaders of these banks, these private institutions, need to be brought to heel, to use just a phrase. Some of these banks were out of control, making bad loans, very little oversight. So in an interconnected world, doesn't that mean that, that we all potentially may suffer if one of these, even just one of these tax havens goes south?
If you have a bank making bad loans, and whether it was Citibank in the U.S. or whether it was the Bank of Cyprus or whatever the names of the banks are that got in trouble there, they should be wound down. We should have done, instead of doing the corrupt TARP bailout, we should have done in the U.S. what Sweden did in the early 90s, or for that matter, what the U.S. did with the S&Ls. When a financial institution becomes insolvent, it should be put into receivership, its assets should be sold off, the depositors should then be paid off, but the big shareholders and the big bondholders should lose their money because they didn't do their due diligence. Now, that has nothing to do with tax havens. It has everything to do with sometimes banks are poorly managed. I mean, that's part of the free market. If capitalism without bankruptcy is like religion without hell, and TARP was, I guess, the Unitarian Church of government policy.
So let's move it forward just a little bit. Austerity really seems to be a dividing line in terms of whether that's the best medicine. Austerity has already come to Greece, to Spain, in some form, and likely to come to Cyprus. How does austerity help a nation when it's suffering economically?
Ultimately, you can't consume more than you produce. Some nations, just like sometimes some households, try to live beyond their means, and that gets them in trouble. Now, it's a huge debate what type of austerity you're going to choose. Unfortunately, with the exception of maybe the Baltic countries like Estonia, the European countries are choosing tax increase austerity. They're imposing the austerity on the private sector, which isn't very good for their economy. What they should be doing, they got in trouble because they had government spending too much money. They should be reducing government spending, not raising taxes. Now, that's one debate, what type of austerity. Then you have the Keynesians out there who are saying, well, gee, we got in trouble because we overspent. Let's spend a bunch more because that's going to somehow goose the economy. Well, that didn't work for Hoover and Roosevelt in the 30s. It didn't work for Bush in 2008. It didn't work for Obama in 2009. It didn't work for Japan in the 1990s. So what I always tell my Keynesian friends, show me one bit of evidence that this policy has ever worked.
So I guess in the end, like there are good and bad tax havens, there's good and bad austerity?
Yes, and there are good and bad non-tax havens. Ultimately, everything depends on whether people, whether they're in government or in the private sector, are making prudent, intelligent decisions.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Daniel Mitchell, economist and senior fellow with the CATO Institute here in Washington, D.C. Well, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing the thoughts. And before you go, I hope you'll take just a moment to send us any questions or comments that you might have. You can reach us through our website. That's www.voanews.com/ontheline. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you again next week on the Line.
A director is the driving artistic source for a motion picture. It is the director's responsibility to communicate to the cast and crew members all aspects of the filmmaking process. Sean Levy graduated from the drama department at Yale University and then went on to study film in the Master's Film Production program at USC. Mr. Levy has gone on to direct the feature films Cheaper by the Dozen, The Pink Panther, and the original Night at the Museum.
Hi, I'm Sean Levy, director of Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian. You're watching Made in Hollywood. Here's a scene from the movie.
Hey, fellas. How you doing?
Yeah, looky here. If it ain't Mr. Big in the britches himself.
For Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian, what was your role as director and producer on set from beginning to end?
I mean, it's a little schizophrenic being the director and the producer because I would have to be aware of the budget and the logistical aspects of what I was doing and be responsible to the studio who is paying for it. But I also had to be the director who would have to fight for everything creative that I wanted. A lot of it is having a sense of what's going to play in the movie, but what's going to help sell the movie. And wearing both hats makes you think in those terms as well.
It'll have to do.
What? No, that's like the first plane ever made. It's made out of balsa wood and paper.
What kind of responsibilities did you have during post-production?
All responsibilities? Is that an answer? I had to edit the movie. I picked every song. I helped, kind of collaborate with my composer on the music for every scene. I had to give notes and modify every visual effect shot, of which there's about 600. It's a 7-day week, all day and night, because even when you're sleeping, you're kind of dreaming about ideas. But frankly, that's part of why you want a job like this, is you kind of like to live it.
Can't all be Einstein.
I am, we are, he is, you are, me too. And that's the way, we like it.
What advice would you have for teens between the ages of 13 and 16 who would want to be a director or a producer just like you?
Well, my first advice would be to not narrow their education too early. I see these people going and becoming film majors as undergrads, and when you're basically stopping your education at 18 in order to focus exclusively on one thing, I think that's a mistake. I think going to university and getting as much knowledge about as many topics as possible is really not only makes you a better director, it just makes you a more interesting person. And I look back on my education, this movie I had to pull on my knowledge of art history, my knowledge of history, my knowledge of music, and it all comes into play. And so I think a broad-ranging, broad-based education is really important.
Ready, and camera, action.
Are there any specific qualities or characteristics or beliefs that you think a teen should have if they really wanted to succeed as a director?
I think you need to be comfortable leading. If you're not comfortable being a leader, then maybe be a writer, maybe be something else. But if you're a director and you have 150 eyes on you every minute wanting to know what's next, what's your move, you need to have a decision. So decisiveness, leadership, and it better be fun, because it's really stressful, it's really hard, but for me it's mostly fun, and I think you kind of need that bone in your body if you're going to pursue it.
Great Gatsby.
Heart attack and cardiac arrest are major causes of illness and death every year in the United States. Decreasing the risk of those events is associated with being physically active on a regular basis. However, a new study finds certain people engaging in periodic physical activity and sexual activity may have an increased risk for serious cardiac events. Catherine Dolph has more in this report.
A hospital's cardiac care unit. Each year in the United States, millions of people find themselves here after experiencing a heart attack or a severe cardiac event. Physical activity and sexual activity can sometimes play a role in triggering those events, even though previous studies have shown being physically active can help decrease those risks.
This triggering effect was actually significantly different depending on an individual's regular activity levels.
People who exercise frequently, regularly, several times per week, will tend to have a much smaller increase while they are involved in these specific activities.
Doctors Jessica Paulus and Issa DeHabre from Tufts University Medical Center in Boston reviewed data from 14 studies addressing the association between episodic physical activity and sexual activity and heart attacks or deaths due to those heart attacks. Those involved in the studies were mostly men and some women between the ages of 55 and 64.
Episodic physical and sexual activity are associated with an increase in heart attacks, and episodic physical activity is associated with an increase in deaths due to heart attacks.
There is a link between episodic physical activity and sexual activity with the risk of heart attack and death from sudden cardiac events during a very short window of time, along the order of 1 to 2 hours following the physical activity and the sexual activity. For those individuals who were unaccustomed to regular physical activity or who did not typically exercise, this risk was much higher than for those individuals who were regular exercisers.
So this puts an accurate number on what's the risk for the short duration, 1 or 2 hours, while people are involved in physical or sexual activity.
Researchers point out there's no evidence suggesting occasional physical activity or sexual activity is harmful to healthier people, but it may be concerning to those who are at increased risk for cardiac events.
If they are unaccustomed to exercising, but they'd like to start becoming more physically active, they should do so very gradually and under the care and supervision of a physician.